Preference is defined as the selecting of someone or something over another or others. Human beings by nature are preferential, often making choices based on momentary whims or actual calculated desires, which is why it's rather odd to see the discourse over exclusives playing out as it is lately. Over the last few months, I have seen takes such as, "We need to completely end the idea of exclusives and place everything on PC." Which sounds good in theory, but I'm curious whether this is some utopian dream of console consolidation or more sinister attempt at corporate sabotage to get some company executive who probably spends more time doom scrolling on Twitter to hastily erode their brand even further. And I'm not even exaggerating on that latter statement, because now it seems that Xbox president Sarah Bond is getting in on the discourse and stating the concept of console exclusives are indeed antiquated. Yes, Xbox, the brand that decimated their own hardware sales by creating a campaign to state that you don't need the hardware to play their games, and is now having that same hardware being sold in Sam's Club clearance aisles, while rebranding an overclocked ROG Ally X unit and running them with its own custom Windows 11 firmware while selling them for $1,000 a piece. But I digress. In a recent Mashable article, Sarah states the following.
We're really seeing people evolve way past exclusives. The biggest games in the world are available everywhere. You look at Call of Duty, you look at Minecraft, you look at Fortnite, you look at Roblox. That's actually what's really driving community in gaming. That's where people gather and they have experiences. And the idea of locking it to one store or one device is antiquated for most people.
Now, my personal feelings on the matter are as follows. Third-party games shouldn't be locked into exclusives. The goal is largely to make enough money making games for these companies to keep their doors open and to ensure that they can make even more games in the future. Releasing third-party games in a multi-platform rollout is beneficial, especially if the game is successful. However, when we are talking about first-party games being exclusives, we should also understand the axiom that software moves hardware. This axiom has been common knowledge even back in the early days of video games. This particular axiom has kept Xbox alive even in its darkest of times, meaning the Xbox One era. Being able to only get Halo and Gears on the Xbox, with maybe the slight exception of a PC release on the Games for Windows moniker, has made sense, and it wasn't like the competition didn't have alternatives either. Sony had Killzone and Resistance Fall of Man. Nintendo had Metroid Prime, despite that being only a first-person adventure title. Each one of those titles mentioned were confirmed system sellers, Prime being what sold me on getting a GameCube and a Wavebird controller. When Sarah talks about the antiquity of locking experiences to one store or one device, it somehow seems reminiscent of the sleazy playboy who lectures about his disinterest in monogamy while ending the fling with a now teary-eyed waif. Or, if we were to turn the tables, the woman stating to her doting partner that she has to find herself, which is code for I need to take as many dicks as possible before I know that you are the one. Crassness aside, the move itself just seems as if Xbox is furthering its descent. Hardware price hikes, Game Pass price hikes, developer kit price hikes, and $1,000 handhelds are not a good sign of stability or brand confidence. But for some reason, that is the path they have chosen for themselves. But are they correct in stating that the concepts of exclusives are antiquated? Well, according to one former Blizzard president and former Xbox vice president, Mike Ybarra disagrees. In response to Sarah's statement, Ybarra said, "Someone go tell Nintendo that the exclusives are antiquated." And to be fair, that is a hell of a rebuttal. Nintendo is the poster child of the axiom software drives hardware, and has benefited from sticking to that axiom for decades. Mario is more recognizable than Mickey Mouse, and the Switch fluctuates from being the highest selling console whenever Sony isn't producing PlayStation 2 sales out of thin air. They have stayed the course and constantly reaped the benefits of that through a devoted following. By comparison, that is the ideogram of what brand confidence is. Of course, game journalists often try to downplay this fact, but what the hell do they know? If Nintendo is not as successful as these journalists claim, then why is it that everyone wants their games on the PlayStation, the Xbox, and the PC? Let's think about that for a second. The competing platforms are supposedly so lucrative that they're outselling Nintendo, but they want Nintendo games, which tend to not only sell well, but sell continually throughout the console's lifecycle on their platforms. In context, these games are being begged to be placed on the Xbox and the PlayStation, two brands that are currently cutting losses by offloading their titles onto PC. When you're actually successful, you're not moving in desperation. You're definitely not having to consider making moves that would erode your own brand or compromise your own integrity. That is the difference. Nintendo, even with their legal issues and their other problems, are still in a good position to maintain their current business strategy, which is to make games that will sell their hardware. The average gamer or Twitter user can whine about that all they want, but that is an actual fact backed by data. Everyone is, of course, entitled to their own opinion, but if exclusives are actually an antiquated concept, why does the concept of exclusives work well in industries other than just gaming? Only Burger King has the Whopper. Only McDonald's has the Big Mac and a Quarter Pounder. Only Wendy's has the Baconator. Yet we find ourselves often basing our choice of restaurants on those brand-specific items as well as others. The short answer would be that preferences are a vital part of consumer choice and healthy brand competition. Without choice and competition, companies get complacent, companies tend to falter, and they tend to resort to bad decision-making to supposedly right the ship. In a different article, Ybarra reflected on the "This is an Xbox" campaign and said the following.
Only a moron would continue to make console hardware when the games all go third-party, Ybarra explained. He believes that in order to shift back to the status of a regular console maker, have to go back to exclusive, make great hardware at a loss, and strive to win the living room. However, Ybarra notes, that's not their strategy, but the issue arises when Xbox tries to play the middle ground between first and third party. I said 1,000 times, get a clear strategy and rip the band-aid off and focus on execution. Otherwise, death by 1,000 needles.
From an analytical standpoint, I definitely see the exclusives discourse as some form of FUD, or fear, uncertainty, and doubt. This is a play poised to push a form of equity poisoning onto the gaming industry, and it seems to be working on at least one gaming division in particular. There is a difference between what is just and fair, air quotes, which is clearly subjective in the eyes of the buzzword-toting bleeding heart activist, and what is actually good for business. And I doubt that Bond, Spencer, or Matt Booty seem to get at this point what's actually good for business. I do feel that Sony is actively watching Microsoft from the sidelines while dipping their toes into diversifying their own first-party offerings. Notice that even with God of War, Horizon Zero Dawn, Helldivers, and a few other titles being moved to Steam and on rival hardware, they're keeping some of their stronger titles like Team Asobi's Astrobot close to the chest. That is not coincidence. There is a legitimate reason for that. But I'll let you figure out what that is. Thank you, and I'll see you next boss fight.